We will have now our next speaker, Professor Erin Kelly. She is the Sloan Distinguished Professor of Work and Organization Studies and co-director of the MIT Institute for Work and Employment Research. She will speak about doing hybrid work well, innovative approaches for minimizing overload and burnout. Professor Kelly, please.
Well, thank you. It is a delight to be with you. Let me get a little bit settled. And I am a walker, so, raise your hand if you can't hear me. I also am the daughter of a preacher, so I have this inclination to say, don't sit in the back pews, come on up. So feel free to adjust your space in the room as well. So thank you, Eduardo and team, for the invitation to share some of my work with you and to talk about the implications for doing hybrid strategies well. Since I am up here by myself, I'm going to go ahead and do this, and then you can see me full-faced and natural. So it's really a pleasure to be here. I'm going to share some specific research, but in the context of my larger research agenda. So let me just share a little bit about that. The question that drives my work is, how do we organize workplace policies and practices to promote well-being while also supporting and ideally improving organizational performance? And so I have an array of studies, many of them collaborative. The newest site is a launched website with some Harvard colleagues that I have up here. But mostly I'm going to be drawing on my recently published book called Overload: How Good Jobs Went Bad and What We Can Do About It. And as I address this core question of how do we organize work to support employees' well-being and organizational performance, I really take an equity lens as well. So I am interested in how is work working for populations who have traditionally been less represented or marginalized in corporate settings too. So gender, race, and age questions are part of this. So what about this past 18 months? These questions are right at the forefront of what we have all lived through. And of course, we had this wonderful opportunity, I would say. Necessity was indeed the mother of invention, and we learned how to work differently overnight, literally, right? So for skeptics who thought that remote work, for example, was not feasible or was only feasible in specific jobs, we saw across the board how many different types of workers and types of organizations can make this adjustment. But as you know, and I know as survivors who have lived through this, it's not all rosy. And so some interesting data came from now 9 months ago from a major survey conducted by Microsoft looking cross-nationally that found almost 40% of employees were saying they were exhausted, over half were feeling overworked, and 40% were considering looking for new jobs. I don't need to tell you this, you have lived this, you are trying to solve for this currently. But the reality is that people pushed ahead and we had all hands on deck for month after month after month, right? And we are in a situation now where we need to figure out how to work smarter and how to work in a way that is sane and sustainable. And so that's the question that I'm hoping we will be able to address together. And I'm going to say up front that none of us know exactly how this is going to play out. This is such a period of experimentation. But I would say the good news is we can draw on some research findings. The work that I'm going to share of my own is at the core, but also, of course, I've been studying this field for a good long time and identify some guiding principles that I think will serve us well going forward. So the work I'm going to talk about was done as part of a large collaboration. It was federally funded with support from the National Institutes of Health and the Centers for Disease Control. And our team was charged with the question of looking at how specific work conditions might be altered to support health and well-being. And even though this was done, I should go back to this study was done, of course, pre-pandemic. The remote work and the opportunity to work differently was really at the center of the innovation that we studied. And so it turns out to have real relevance for this period that we're in now, these interesting times that we're living through and what we're planning for going forward. So when I talk about remote work, let me do a little bit of terminology classification, and hybrid strategies is at the core of what I'm talking about today. But that term wasn't used in this way 2 short years ago. So let's talk about what we're talking about first. On-site work exclusively was the norm and was the unquestioned default for so long. Then in the last 20 years, many US companies and many companies worldwide adopted flexible work policies that generally were structured in a particular way, what we call flexibility as accommodation. And in these policies, the idea was a select few people can ask for and perhaps get new arrangements approved by their manager. So this limited work from home with manager's approval, of course, was floating out in there. And then all of you know as well, executives and high-level managerial employees had more control just by virtue of their jobs. But when we're talking about folks in the middle and lower, that you generally had to be approved. Then the last 18 months, for many of us, have been exclusive remote work, jumping down to the bottom here. And hybrid is used for all the stuff in the middle, but let's get a little more specific about that. I'm referring to hybrid work as a mix of some time on site and some time working from home or another location. And you can think of that as a fairly fixed schedule. So for example, 2 days a week you're going to be in the office and the other 3 not, and that's going to be announced and known and shown to everybody on your Outlook calendar in advance. That would be hybrid and fixed. Or you could have hybrid and flexible, which is what we had studied, again, before the term was invented. And for several reasons I'm going to go into is the recommended model that I'm going to be promoting here. And we'll talk some about exclusive remote work as we go along as well. So to finish setting this stage, I'm going to take you to a question we asked the IT workers whom we were studying, which is, given the way things are today, how do you feel about your work? So you might answer that yourself. Just think of what's the first term that comes to mind. You might think about asking those who report to you what they would say. What's the first thing that would come to mind for them? And in the IT division of this Fortune 500 firm that is really at the center of our book, we did the same thing with employees and managers. In these workshops where people could just walk up, write whatever they wanted on the board, no commentary, no evaluation. And this is what we saw from the teams that participated in that workshop. So again, this is before COVID. You'll notice, we just took snapshots of this and then turned it into this word cloud. You'll notice that there are some positively valenced words in here. There are things people appreciated about their jobs, and those are in green. But the overwhelming message is one of stress, frustration, intensity, demands, constant busyness, etc. And so our goal was to see, can we make some changes that are both feasible and not going to hurt the company, maybe benefit the company, to address these concerns. One thing I want to call out is that family is here, but this is not all about family. So Phyllis Moen, my co-author, and I have studied work and family policies and challenges for over 20 years in different countries and different company contexts. But our perspective really shifted over the course of this study. And we came to see that this is a story of work intensity, of work speed up, and of what we're going to call overload. And it's a story not to minimize the work-family challenges, but it's a story that has a broad reach that we heard from people in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s with all kinds of life situations. So the conversation about work-family challenges and work-life balance is an important one, but it's an incomplete one. And we need to broaden how we think and talk about this. So what we learned from the IT workforce we were studying, and what lots of other research has found in a variety of contexts, is many professionals and managers are sharing that the current ways of working don't seem sustainable. And in fact, we use this term overload to get at this sense that you have too much to do with too few resources. And that's actually the classic definition of stress, if you think about it. You're expected to do this, and the time, staff, team that you have available is not going to help, you're not going to be able to get there. So the company invited us in because they were concerned about recruitment, retention, burnout, and this was a little less obvious to the executive level, but the folks we would do interviews with could really articulate all the ways that intensified work was negatively affecting the quality of work that they were doing and their innovation, right? So everyone was feeling we're just barely hanging on. One of the themes that we heard repeatedly in interviews was the idea, I used to love this job, but I don't anymore, right? This is a good match. These are good people. I'm committed to the mission, and yet it's not feasible to continue working in this way. So those are some of the concerns that we heard from employees. Also, health and sleep problems. We didn't ask any questions directly in our qualitative interviews about sleep, but we heard all about sleep, and we heard about hives, and we heard about chronic conditions in the chiropractor's office, et cetera, as well as this family time squeeze. And so we argue that this is driven, again, not by how work and family come together, but by intensified work and by specific work practices. Those include, of course, feeling a need to work long hours, but also feeling the need to be always on and always responsive to the phone, the chat, the Slack, whatever it is. Given what people were asked to do, they developed, and we often also have developed these habits of multitasking. Zoom is so good for this. You think you can, do multiple things at once. But that meant that the real work, for them, the technical work of writing code or testing code or making IT architecture decisions, got pushed to the evenings and the weekends when there were fewer interruptions. And in this context as well, there was a fairly, what they would say, old school culture. So regardless of with whom you were coordinating your work and the calls with India that you might be on at 5 a.m., you were also expected to be visible in the office at this time. So that was the kind of context, and we wanted to see whether we could address this. Now, as I've already hinted at, workplace flexibility policies have been around for a long time, but we didn't want to adopt a traditional one, and there's a couple of reasons for that. This flexible work as accommodation it occurs when there's an official policy allowing some flexible work, and yet it's not fully legitimate. It's often negotiated individually. Phyllis calls it mother may I flexibility. You have to be brave enough to ask your boss if you can do something different. Everyone knows that that may be allowed, but it's not fully seen as the way we work here. It's not seen as what ideal workers do. And so other research has demonstrated this idea of flexibility stigma, that we often have in the past, again, allowed flexibility but then penalized people who pursued it, right? Which sets up all of this frustration and all of these dynamics. And given the realities of many families, now, of course, there's wide variety across families in who does what, but women and moms and daughters of elderly relatives, on average, spend more time in caregiving, and so are more tempted to pursue this flexibility despite those negative career consequences. So we've had this system for the last 20 years or so where flexibility is supposedly allowed, but sometimes ends up reinforcing gender inequality. So we didn't want to set it up that way. So what we did was develop, as part of this larger research team, what we call a work redesign approach. And I'm going to walk you through the key elements that distinguish it from other forms of flexibility. First, whole units, whole teams, whole organizations go through this together and reconsider when, where, and how they work as a collective process. So right there, you've changed that dynamic from mother may I to we need to think about how we're going to work smarter together. The second element is the motivation. We call it a dual agenda perspective. From the beginning, we emphasize that we're looking for making work more effective, efficient, and sustainable for all employees. Of course, if people decide to talk about their family challenges, that is perfectly fine, but we're not starting with that point. We're starting with a broad perspective of we can all benefit from this. Just to hit a couple more of these key elements in a different way, this creates broader access to work from home options. Now, as I'm going to share later on, there are jobs that require being on site, right? But there's still a sense that you're part of this conversation about how you can change the way you work to benefit both the organization and your personal life. Team conversations are really at the heart of this. And there's another component that helped managers develop their skills and confidence in managing in this way rather than being, policy enforcers, which most managers genuinely appreciate because, you trust and respect, or you respect the people that work for you, and to be able to demonstrate your trust in them feels good as well. So we evaluated this with a cluster randomized trial, which is or a group randomized trial, which is a field experiment. And just to walk you through this briefly, we survey all of these employees and managers, about 1,000 participants at time one. We identify 56 work units, and we flip a coin, basically. We randomize which ones move through this new initiative, which was called STAR in this workplace, but the name doesn't matter. I've described the key elements. And then we follow them over time. And this is really critical because we are comparing apples to apples, right? So this is an example of a simplified example of our analysis. And right here, these are the two groups. They look the same at baseline. It was just random whether they were in the STAR group or not. Compared to a lot of management research, I'm going to say, this is a very rigorous approach because often we're looking at how do employees over here feel compared to employees over here, and even if we're trying to look within industry, we're not really controlling for all the other aspects of the organizational policy, work, et cetera, et cetera. So we've got apples to apples here, and we can see what changes, or this would be an example of something that doesn't change. So what did we find here? I think since we have lived through this pandemic era, some of this will not be surprising, but we have, again, rigorous evidence on this. We find higher job satisfaction, reduced burnout, and better sleep. We had people wear actigraphy watches, so this is objectively measured sleep as well as feeling rested upon waking. People felt better work-life balance or integration. Again, I've said this isn't the whole story, but it is an important part of the story. We see improved mental health as measured through validated measures of stress and psychological distress, which is a non-clinical indicator of anxiety and depression symptoms. And this is one of the very few places where we saw gender differences. So in stress and distress, women in this IT firm reported higher levels at baseline, and STAR helped them move down, right? All the other things, we really see broad impacts across genders, family status, and ages as well. We were also excited to see better cardiometabolic health here, and that was measured through a variety of indicators, biomarker indicators, and really was honed in among older workers and others who had higher risks at baseline. We saw some improvements. I'm going to move quickly through this, but I love these findings. We had a sub-study of adolescents. I've got 2 teen boys, and so the fact that my work affects their lives is familiar to me, but we did see that having a parent in STAR was associated with more time with teen kids, healthier sleep patterns, and better emotional health. Again, comparing to counterparts whose parents also worked for the same company, but were in the control group. You're probably interested in benefits for the firm, and so let me start with the null result, the no news. We see no positive impact, but also no detriment on productivity or quality, right? So that's an interesting question. How do we evaluate steady state here in the context of all of these improvements in well-being? But employees who were randomly in the initiative were 40% less likely to quit over the 3 years that we followed the company data. And so this produced a high ROI of about $1.60 for every dollar spent on the initiative through that change in retention patterns. All right, so that's the study, and now I want to take a step back in the last 12, 13, 14 minutes, talk about what do we do, what can we learn from that pre-pandemic study that can guide us in this current era. And as I've said already, people have unique situations and we're all figuring this out, but I do think there's some really critical messages that are broadly applicable. And so Phyllis and I have identified these 5 principles. The first message is remote work is only part of the equation, right? We're all figuring out what's our remote work policy. That's not the right way to ask the question. We need to be tackling when, where, and how employees work and how they work together in an integrated way. And so that means setting up team conversations to help people develop new norms. I completely understand that a policy declaration is very appealing and clarity can be useful to employees, but it's got to be coupled with these deliberate team conversations about how we want to work together. Otherwise, you just are scratching the surface and you're unlikely to see the benefits that we were able to document. The second point, and this is interesting, it's not really about the remote work. That's not the critical driver of these benefits. So we were able to measure psychological mechanisms, and this is consistent with a large research literature from other studies as well, that really hones in on the fact that having a sense of choice or control is what drives these benefits from the perspective of employees, and knowing that you're supported and trusted by your managers and colleagues. So it's not about 2 days a week in the office or 4 days a week in the office or 19 out of 20 days a week in the office. It's about that sense of having some latitude and feeling supported and respected. Now, another implication from this finding is that a blanket strategy of closing the office or sending people home is risky. So the real estate costs are real. I know they're real. I know you probably know them and have figured them out. But the dynamic of being sent home is completely different than the dynamic of feeling trusted and respected to put the pieces of your life together in a way that works for you and that allows you to perform at your best. The third principle is that the decisions about remote work depend on the work itself. So the conversation needs to be oriented to both work effectiveness and work-life balance from the beginning. And so previous research has indicated, this is pre-pandemic, and there's probably some industry differences, but several different studies have found moderate remote work tends to be the sweet spot for job satisfaction, relationship with coworkers, and job performance, right? In part because some of our job performance depends on those relationships with coworkers as well as our own level of motivation and engagement. So that's something to keep in mind. And in fact, I forget whether it was last week or 2 weeks ago, a new study came out that really talks about what are some of the concerns about exclusive remote work. So now I'm switching from a hybrid, which I've talked about and promoted, to another option that is now on the table is exclusive remote work. And so what this team did was take data from Microsoft employees. It's anonymized data, but they have detailed data on who connected with whom electronically during the period of exclusive remote work, right? With firm-wide remote work. And the key findings are that we've had a narrowing of our networks. Firm-wide exclusive remote work caused the collaboration network of these employees to become more static and siloed. So we made fewer connections to new folks. When we did make those connections, we spent less time investing in those connections and what we could learn from those people. And we were more likely, to stay within our functional silos. So there's fewer bridging ties. I don't know how many of you have MBAs, but when I teach my core organizational processes class, we spend a lot of time on the basics of network science, and it's very clear that innovation comes from disparate information and from being able to bridge different perspectives. And so this fewer bridging ties is a concern. They also found an increase in asynchronous communication, basically email and chat rather than video and voice calls, which of course the more complex the message is, the harder it is to convey through those channels. And so they argue that together these effects may make it harder for employees to acquire and share new information, so may in the longer term affect the quality of work and the possibilities for innovation, drawing again on a large literature in network science. I'm adding the question of who's going to be most hurt by these changes in network patterns, right? Junior employees, that kind of mentoring and development, and those who were perhaps less integrated into casual networks previously. So I think that is something to keep in mind when we consider remote work. Just to be clear, I'm not saying remote work can never work. I'm saying it requires a lot of effort to override or counteract what we might expect to see based on this study and other supporting research. All right, so back to the principles from my own work. I think we were talking about this. Yes, this point here is just added. Exclusive remote work has risks that need to be carefully managed. The fourth principle is that remote work can easily increase overload and burnout, right? Just going home is not a solution. And we need to address that and recognize that and provide explicit encouragement to set boundaries. So you have all experienced this blurring of space and time, maybe coupled with pressure to be available to your team because you want to be supportive of them. I have another study that is just about to go under review, not just based on IT, but across many different workforces and industry, some pre-pandemic German data. And what we find there is if you look at people who work from home and ask, are you working from home during regular hours, what we call replacement work from home, or are you working from home beyond traditional or contracted hours, what we call extension work from home, you see different relationships to well-being and to turnover intentions. And in particular, it's when we have work from home extending beyond normal hours that you see increased risk of planning to quit as compared to people who only are in the office. So in our study, the work redesign approach provided deliberate space for team conversations and managers to be explicit about what they were and were not rewarding. And for people to celebrate the need to step back at times and be away from work in order to do their best work, and to get some reassurance from managers that they weren't just rewarding the person who was quickest to respond on the chat thread or whatever it was. The fifth principle may not surprise you, knowing that I am on the faculty here. I'm suggesting that we need to collect data to learn and adapt as we go. And in particular, I would suggest that we measure organizational performance over time, that we measure employee engagement and well-being over time, and I've outlined what that might look like, and that we pay attention to equity and inclusion. So let me hit a little bit more on this last point, which ties back to an earlier point that I made. Because in the past we had formal flexible work options, but they kind of very subtly played on gender stereotypes, men often avoided them, right? So there's a great study of management consultants that looks at who pulls back from travel as part of the formal flexibility arrangement and who just pulls back from travel and doesn't announce it. And you saw that, about a quarter of the senior consultants were pulling back on their travel commitments, but the men were doing that under the radar. And so their careers were not affected in the same way that the women who took advantage of the formal company policy faced. So, that is a real risk and something to be aware of. We would hope that that paradigm is broken, right? That the pandemic normalized flexible work and a variety of ways of working across the board. But we have to remain vigilant to see who pursues flexible work options or hybrid options going forward, and make sure we don't reinstate that kind of two-tier system. So that's about it. I see this as a very exciting moment to reimagine the way we work and the future of work. I recognize fully that there's going to be things that seem practical to each of you in the situations that you're in, the firms and the locations that you're in, and things that don't, which is why I try to take it to this level of principles that can guide your thinking as you're making some of these decisions. I also wanted to mention my PhD students and I see this as an area where there's more to learn, and we're always interested in exploring research partnerships, particularly as firms make changes in policies and practices and might want some help evaluating what that means for them and their employees. Let me just close this section by mentioning a few more resources if they're of interest to you. So the book is available, and in fact, we had a paperback edition come out this month with a pandemic-focused foreword. Appendix 3 of the book has some ideas for action. Secondly, I want to be sure to explicitly say everything that we used, all of the training materials that we used in our NIH and CDC-funded study are freely available for anyone to download and learn from and adapt as you choose to in your own organization. So this Work Family Health Network website has those toolkits. I think that we at MIT did a nice job this spring and summer figuring out how we were going to approach things. And so that toolkit is also available. It is similar in some ways, but is less intensive, right? So it has some guidance on how to have these conversations without doing the full-scale workshops that were part of our study. And I would invite you to consider this is in the context of a sense of employer responsibility for changing the way we work to promote health and well-being. So I'm going to close with this connection to our brand new toolkit that came out 2 weeks ago. It goes well beyond workplace flexibility and reviews promising studies and caselets where organizations made a concrete change in policies and practices and we have a documented improvement in well-being. I see this as a complement to, or perhaps a substitute for, wellness benefits, wellness initiatives, which have their place, but sometimes don't get to the root cause of how stress at work is affecting our health and well-being. So that is it for me. Thank you so much for the attention, and I am very excited to have questions and comments. Yes, that's terrific. I will go to the pigeonhole questions in a minute, but I'd love to hear from you in the room. Sir? Yes.
I'll also put this on pigeonhole.
Okay.
But as a remote work, hybrid, flexible work policy, have you seen in the intermittent years since the beginning of COVID, this type of policy being more driven from an HR perspective? Or is a policy flow down? Or is a request by managers?
That's a great question. So, I mean, in the pandemic, I think one of the challenges is we didn't have a choice, right? And companies didn't have a choice in many cases, depending on the lockdown policy and who counted as an essential worker. I think going from this point forward, it's an important question. Who gets to make these decisions? Is it HR? Is it the executive team? Is it bottom-up responding to pressure from employees? And I think that it may be all of those things, but we're at a point, I'm sure you're feeling this acutely, we're at a point where retention concerns are real and recruitment concerns are real. And so there's a bottom-up kind of interest in figuring this out. Now, the interesting thing is we know what we want as, say, frontline employees. We know what we want, but we may not be thinking through of all the implications that has for how we do our work together. So I do think it needs to be multi-level where we're supporting managers in figuring out how to do this well. Did that get it? Okay, great. All right, this 4 votes. The president of our company wants everybody back in the office and is costing us good talent. Any guidance? Wow, that's a big one. I think as with all organizational change challenges, one question is, what's the concern here? What's the concern behind the president's perspective? Is it comfort in something that could be gently moved away from, or is it really about not being able to imagine collaboration happening, right? And so I think that the positive examples from what the firm did in this period are useful. And then perhaps some of the evidence that I've shared about benefits to employees and to the organization could be helpful. One concern that you hear all the time is this is a path to slacking, right? And yet I think we have seen in the last year and a half highly productive workers from all over the place. So that maybe can counter that a bit. The other thing that we often actually used in the training workshops was, how do you know there wasn't slacking beforehand, right? If there's a performance problem, there's a performance problem. It's probably not solely tied to the work location there. Great. So another question is, we're facing high attrition, and one explanation given to explain it is more virtual options creating new opportunities. Do you see that in your research versus people leaving due to being unhappy? Yeah, so my research doesn't touch on this directly, but we are seeing that the local labor market is no longer a meaningful construct, right? That there are many jobs where you can recruit very broadly, and so employees may be looking beyond their local labor market. From a DEI perspective, that actually gives firms some opportunities to reach out to some more racially or ethnically diverse communities than they have been able to in the past. What we would want to be careful about there is that those newly hired folks are fully integrated and have the same, opportunities for advancement and are not pulled in as remote workers and then frustrated by the opportunities that they face. Great. All right. Did you observe a sense of unfairness between workers in the same company where some are required to be on-site, manufacturing workers, compared to those who could work remotely, support staff? It's an important question, and it may be something we touch on in the panel as well. I only talked about the IT firm, but I also studied another Fortune 500 company with somewhat similar initiative. In both cases, there were a cluster of employees who couldn't take full advantage of this flexibility initiative. And so, to some extent, there is frustration that needs to be acknowledged, but the fact that it was now clearly driven by the work role and not by whether you were lucky enough to report to a flexible manager or have an old school manager, actually moved it towards more acceptance of that variation in experience. So I think that really the way we frame it as being about this is a decision about the work and creativity in how that work is done. So over here, I've been working with MIT on their new policy, and so I've been talking to some of our HR leadership quite a bit. HR is experimenting with a partially remote receptionist, right? And so being able to see how far can we stretch this role, or if this role is a site-bound role, what other paths can we help people identify can be appreciated as well. Great. I am a little unclear on time. I think do we have time for one more? Okay, one more question. We'll take this 2 votes question. What's your advice for a company who feels strongly about in-person work culture, but some employees now only want to work remotely? So I guess the question there is, what does feeling strongly about in-person work culture mean? Is that a desire to feel connected, to have a social life at work? And are there ways to create that with some people who are remote only? So, that's a challenging strategy to follow. I'll also mention some firms are going remote only, and people are walking because they want the in-person opportunity and the connections as well. Okay, terrific. Thank you.